The drum stopped the moment Elena Voss stepped into the circle of firelight, and every eye in the Blackthorn pack turned to watch her tremble. She had waited 18 years for this night. The moon ceremony was supposed to be the happiest moment of her life, the night the bond would rise from her chest like a second heartbeat and show her the face of the one person in the world meant only for her. Instead, she stood on cold stone in a white dress that suddenly felt like a costume, staring up at a man whose golden eyes held nothing but disgust. Alpha King Damien Ashford was the most powerful wolf in the Northern Territories, ruler of a pack that stretched across 3 mountains, feared by enemies and worshipped by his own people. He was also, according to the invisible thread now burning across Elena's ribs, her fated mate. He did not smile. He did not reach for her hand the way the old stories said an alpha should. He looked at her the way a man looks at a stain on his coat. "No," he said. The single word rolled through the crowd like thunder. Elena felt her knees threaten to give out, but she locked them in place, refusing to let 500 pairs of eyes watch her fall. "Damien," his mother whispered from the edge of the circle, a warning in her voice. He ignored her. He stepped closer to Elena, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him, close enough that the bond in her chest screamed at her to reach for him, to beg him to stay. She hated that scream. She hated her own body for betraying her in front of everyone she had ever known. "I reject this bond," Damien said, loud enough for the pack elders standing behind him to hear every syllable. "She is the daughter of a lesser beta. She has no training in leadership, no strength worth speaking of, and no place beside a king." Someone in the crowd gasped. A few younger wolves shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to meet Elena's eyes. Her own father, Beta Aldrich Voss, stood frozen near the front, his jaw tight, but he said nothing. He would not challenge an alpha king, not even for his daughter. Elena's mother had died when she was 6. There was no mother now to step forward and shield her from this. There was only Elena, standing alone under the full moon, feeling the bond that should have connected 2 souls snap in half like a dry branch. The pain of a rejected bond was supposed to fade with time. In that moment, it felt like her ribs were caving in around her heart. "You will forget this ever happened," Damien continued, turning his back to her as though she were already gone from his memory. "Both of us will move on. There is no shame in this. Only truth. No shame." Elena almost laughed, except laughing would have broken the last thread of composure she had left. She could feel heat rushing to her face, could feel the whispers starting behind cupped hands, could feel the particular cruelty of 200 people pretending not to stare while staring anyway. She lifted her chin. If he wanted her to fall apart in front of his pack, he would not get the satisfaction. "Then it is done," she said, her voice steadier than she believed possible. "I will not chase a man who does not want me." For one flickering second, something crossed Damien's face. Surprise, maybe. He had expected tears, pleading, the kind of desperate scene that would prove his judgment correct. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked out of the circle with her spine straight, leaving him standing there with a version of himself he did not recognize. Marcus Whitlock found her 20 minutes later, sitting on the low stone wall that marked the edge of the training yard, far from the bonfire and the music that had resumed as though nothing unusual had happened. He was the only person who had followed her. "Elena," he said her name softly, the way he had since they were children racing through the woods together, before pack politics had made everything complicated. He sat down beside her without asking permission, his shoulder brushing hers. She did not look at him. She was staring at her own hands, at the faint tremor she could not make stop. "I'm fine," she said. "You're not fine. Nobody would be fine after that." "I said I'm fine, Marcus." He let the silence sit between them for a while, patient in the way only an old friend could be. Somewhere behind them, the bonfire crackled and the pack laughed and danced, as though the humiliation of a rejected girl were nothing more than an evening's entertainment already forgotten. "He's a fool," Marcus finally said. "Everyone knows it. You should have heard the elders talking after you left. Half of them think he made the biggest mistake of his life. The other half agree with him," Elena said quietly, "that I'm not fit to stand beside a king. The other half don't know you." Marcus turned to face her fully. "I do. I've known you since you were 7 years old, and you punched Cormac Riley in the nose for pulling my hair. You've been patching up scraped knees and broken bones in this pack since you were old enough to hold bandages. You have more strength in your little finger than half the wolves who cheered when he humiliated you tonight." A tired, watery laugh escaped her despite herself. "You always know what to say. I mean every word." They sat there until the fire in the distance burned low, until the sounds of celebration faded into the quiet hum of a mountain night. Elena did not cry, not then. She saved that for later, alone in her room, when there was no one left to see her fall apart, And even then she allowed herself only a short while before she scrubbed her face clean and told herself it was finished. The next morning, the whole pack knew. Word traveled faster than wind in a place like Blackthorn, and by the time Elena walked to the healer's cabin to begin her shift, she could feel the weight of stares following her down the path. Some were pitying, some were curious. A few, worse than either, were amused. She kept her head high and her hands busy, changing bandages, mixing salves, checking on old Enid Marsh's fever, exactly as she had every morning for the past 2 years since she started training under the pack's head healer. Work, she had learned, was the one thing that did not care whether she had been rejected in front of the entire pack. A wound needed cleaning whether or not her heart was broken. A fever needed watching whether or not she had been called unfit to be a queen. Her father found her there in the early afternoon, standing awkwardly in the doorway of the cabin, as though he were not quite sure he was welcome. Elena, father. He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. Aldrich Voss was a good beta, loyal to his alpha, careful with pack law, and utterly unequipped to comfort a daughter whose heart had just been shattered in public. I only came to see that you were well. I'm well, she said, and this time the lie came easier. The Alpha King's decision reflects on our family, he said, and there it was. The thing she had known was coming since the moment Damien said no. People will talk. It would be wise for you to keep a low presence for a while. Let the gossip settle. Elena set down the roll of bandages in her hands very carefully, because if she did not, she thought she might throw something. You want me to hide? I want you to be sensible. I did nothing wrong, father. I was rejected. That was his choice, not mine. And yet somehow I am the one who must hide. Aldrich's jaw tightened, the same expression he wore when facing a decision he did not like but felt powerless to change. That is simply how it is, Elena. A rejected mate carries a mark, whether we wish it or not. She said nothing else. There was nothing else to say that would change his mind, and she was too tired to try. He left a moment later, murmuring something about pack duties, and Elena stood alone in the cabin, staring at the shelves of dried herbs and bottled remedies that had become the closest thing she had to a sanctuary. It would have been easy to let her father's words sink into her, to shrink herself down into the small, quiet shame he expected of her. Instead, something hardened inside her chest, right where the broken bond still ached. If the pack wanted to whisper about her, let them whisper. If Damien Ashford wanted to believe she was unworthy, let him believe it. She would not spend her life waiting for a man who had made his contempt for her clear in front of everyone she loved. She finished her shift at the healer's cabin, walked the long way home along the ridge overlooking the valley, and watched the sun sink behind the mountains that marked the edge of Blackthorn territory. Somewhere beyond those peaks was a life that had nothing to do with rejected bonds or disappointed fathers or Alpha Kings who thought so little of her. She did not know yet what that life would look like. She only knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she intended to find it. That night, alone in her room, she allowed herself exactly 1 hour to cry. She let the tears come for the girl who had believed, just 1 day earlier, that the moon ceremony would give her a partner who cherished her. She mourned the version of her future that had died in that firelit circle. Then, when the hour was over, she washed her face, braided her hair, and told the mirror that she would never again let anyone see her broken. Across the mountain, in the grand stone hall of the Ashford estate, Damien Ashford sat alone by a cold hearth, turning a glass of untouched wine in his hand. His advisors had congratulated him on his decision, praising his caution in refusing a bond with a family of lesser standing. His mother had said nothing at all, which somehow felt louder than any argument. He told himself he felt nothing. He told himself the tightness in his chest was simply the natural, temporary discomfort of severing a bond, nothing more than a physical inconvenience that would fade within days. He was an Alpha King. He did not have room in his life for weakness, and love, he had long ago decided, was the most dangerous weakness of all. Outside his window, the moon climbed higher over Blackthorn territory, indifferent to broken bonds and buried regrets. And somewhere far below, a young healer closed her eyes and made a quiet promise to herself that she intended to keep. She would build a life Damien Ashford could never take credit for. She would become someone he could never again dismiss with a single, careless word. She had no idea, not yet, how completely that promise would come true, or whose hand would help her keep it. A jar of crushed nettle root shattered against the stone floor of the healer's cabin, and Elena Voss did not even flinch. 3 months had passed since the moon ceremony, and she had grown practiced at not flinching, at letting things break around her without breaking herself. "You're not even listening to me," said Grace Doyle, the pack's head healer, bending down to help sweep the broken glass into a cloth. "I said Enid Marsh needs her dressing changed twice a day now, not once." I heard you, Elena said, kneeling to help. Twice a day. I'll go after I finish grinding the willow bark. Grace studied her for a moment, the way she often did lately, with the careful attention of someone checking a wound that refused to heal properly. You've been distracted. I'm fine. You keep saying that word like it means something. Elena did not answer. She had said fine so many times over the past 3 months that the word had lost all shape in her mouth. She was, in truth, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The whispers had not stopped. Packmates who once greeted her warmly now offered pitying half-smiles, or, worse, avoided her eyes entirely, as though rejection were something contagious they might catch by standing too close. Her father had grown more distant with each passing week, burying himself in his duties as Beta, speaking to her only when necessary, as though minimizing contact with her might minimize the shame he believed she carried. Elena told herself she did not need his comfort. She told herself a great many things these days, mostly in the quiet hours before sleep, when the ache of the broken bond still surfaced without warning, and reminded her of everything she was trying not to feel. The only steady presence in her life was Marcus. He visited the cabin most evenings, sometimes with an excuse about a training injury, more often with no excuse at all, simply pulling up a stool and talking about nothing important until the tightness in her shoulders eased. He never pushed her to talk about the rejection. He never brought up Damien Ashford's name unless she did first. He simply stayed, steady as the mountain itself, and Elena had come to depend on that steadiness more than she liked to admit. You should come to the gathering tonight, Marcus said that evening, leaning against the cabin doorway while she cleaned her instruments. Simon Wren is hosting a fire by the river. Nothing formal, just food and music. I have patients to check on. Grace can check on patients for one evening. Elena, you cannot spend the rest of your life inside this cabin. She set down the cloth in her hands and looked at him properly. There was concern in his eyes, plain and unguarded, the kind of concern that did not come from pity but from genuine care. It was different from the way the rest of the pack looked at her, and she found she could not quite refuse him. 1 hour, she said, then I'm coming back. The gathering by the river was smaller and quieter than the moon ceremony had been, a handful of pack members sharing roasted meat and cider around a low fire, laughing at old stories, none of the weight of formal ceremony hanging over them. For the first time in months, Elena felt something like ease settle over her shoulders. Nobody here treated her like a cautionary tale. Nobody watched her out of the corners of their eyes, waiting for her to crumble. It was there, sitting beside Marcus with a cup of cider warming her hands, that she first heard the name that would come to matter more than she could have imagined. Kieran Ashford is visiting next week, said Nora Callahan, one of the younger pack healers, settling onto a log across the fire. Border meeting between the packs. My cousin serves in the Redwood territory, says he's nothing like his friend the Alpha King. Kind, apparently. Fair to everyone, regardless of standing. Ashford, Elena repeated carefully, the name settling uneasily in her chest. Cousin, not brother, Nora clarified. Kieran leads the Redwood pack. He and Damien Ashford grew up together, practically brothers by choice if not blood. But from what I hear, Kieran has none of his friend's coldness. Elena said nothing, but she filed the information away without quite meaning to, the way one remembers a stray fact that might matter later. The border meeting arrived a week after that, and with it came the first true test of Elena's resolve to remain unaffected by anything connected to the name Ashford. She had not expected to be present for it. Healers were rarely invited to matters of pack diplomacy. But 3 days before the meeting, a rider from the Redwood territory arrived at Blackthorn's gates bearing news that changed everything. There had been a skirmish along the disputed eastern border, a clash between rogue wolves and a Redwood patrol. Several fighters were wounded, and among them, struck by a blade meant for someone else, was Alpha Kieran Ashford himself. Grace Doyle was called to the healer's hall within the hour, and because Elena was her most trusted apprentice, she was called as well. Elena arrived to find the hall already busy with activity, Redwood pack members crowding anxiously near the door while Grace examined a tall, broad-shouldered man laid across one of the cots, blood soaking through a hastily wrapped bandage at his side. Deep enough to worry about, not deep enough to panic, Grace murmured, already reaching for her supplies. Elena, I need clean cloth and the silver thread, quickly. Elena moved without hesitation, years of training taking over where fear might otherwise have crept in. She had stitched worse wounds than this. She focused on the work, not the identity of the man beneath her hands, until he spoke, his voice rough with pain but edged with dry humor. Should I be concerned that you both look this calm about a hole in my side? Elena glanced up and found herself looking into a pair of warm brown eyes, nothing like the cold gold she had grown so wary of. Kieran Ashford's face was drawn with pain, But there was no arrogance in it. No chill, only a tired, wry sort of patience that surprised her. Calm is generally good for healing, she said. Panic tends to make wounds worse. Fair point. He winced as Grace pressed against the injury to check its depth. Do you have a name, or should I simply address you as the person currently holding my life in her hands? Elena. Elena. He repeated it as though testing the shape of it. Thank you, Elena, for not panicking over the hole in my side. Despite everything, despite the exhaustion of the past months, and the ache that still lived somewhere beneath her ribs, Elena felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward. It was such a small thing, a stranger's easy humor in the middle of pain, but it was the first genuine smile she had allowed herself in longer than she wanted to admit. The stitching took the better part of an hour, Grace guiding the delicate work while Elena assisted, cleaning and threading and pressing bandages with steady hands. Kieran did not complain once, even when the pain must have been considerable, and he kept up a quiet, easy stream of conversation that had nothing to do with pack politics or rejected bonds, simply questions about her training, her opinions on herbal remedies versus modern medicine, small observations that made the work pass faster. By the time Grace finished and stepped back to inspect her work, Elena realized she had spent an entire hour without once thinking of the moon ceremony, without once feeling the familiar ache of humiliation that had shadowed her for months. It was such a strange, unfamiliar relief that she almost did not recognize it. You'll need to rest for at least a week, Grace told Kieran firmly. No shifting, no strenuous activity, and someone should change that dressing daily. I don't suppose either of you would be willing to travel to Redwood territory for daily house calls, Kieran said, though there was a teasing note beneath the words rather than any real expectation. Blackthorn territory has its own healing to attend to, Grace said dryly, already turning to her other patients. Elena, finish wrapping his side, then see to the two fighters by the window. Left briefly alone with him, Elena worked in careful silence, winding clean linen around the stitched wound. Kieran watched her with quiet curiosity, rather than the impatience most patients showed. You're very good at this, he said. I've had practice. I imagine so. This pack seems well cared for. He paused, studying her face for a moment longer than strictly necessary. You look tired, if you don't mind my saying. Not from tonight. From longer than tonight. Elena's hand stilled briefly before she resumed her work, keeping her expression carefully neutral. It has been a difficult few months for the pack. Something in his tone suggested he understood there was more to the story than she was offering, but to her relief, he did not press. Well, whatever it was, I hope it eases soon. This pack deserves a healer who isn't carrying more weight than she should. It was such a simple thing to say, kind without being intrusive, perceptive without being cruel. Elena finished the bandage and stepped back, surprised at how much lighter she felt than she had in months, as though a small window had opened somewhere in a room that had felt sealed shut since the night of the moon ceremony. She did not know yet that Kieran Ashford would return to Blackthorn territory again within the month, this time without the excuse of injury. She did not know that his easy warmth would become a quiet, steady comfort she looked forward to more than she expected. She only knew, as she walked home beneath a sky full of stars that night, that for the first time since her rejection, she had gone an entire evening without feeling broken. It was a small thing. But small things, she was beginning to learn, were sometimes where healing truly began. 2 years changed a person more than they ever expected, and Elena Voss barely recognized the girl who had once stood trembling in a firelit circle, waiting for a king who never wanted her. She stood now in the healer's hall she had helped rebuild from a single crowded cabin into a proper stone building with 3 treatment rooms, a storage cellar full of carefully labeled remedies, and a small garden out back where she grew half the herbs the pack relied on. Grace Doyle had stepped back from most of her duties the previous winter, her joints no longer strong enough for the long hours, and the pack had turned to Elena to lead the healing hall in her place. It had happened so gradually that Elena had barely noticed the shift, until packmates who once whispered about her rejection started calling her by a new title entirely. Healer Voss. It still felt strange in her ears, though she had earned it through 2 years of relentless work, studying old texts long into the night, traveling to neighboring territories to learn techniques Blackthorn had never used, and treating every patient, however minor their complaint, with the same careful attention she gave the worst injuries. She had built something entirely her own, something no rejection could touch, and there was a quiet satisfaction in that, which no amount of gossip could take from her. The gossip had not entirely stopped, of course. Packs had long memories, and there were still those who referred to her, quietly and usually behind her back, as the girl the Alpha King refused. But the whispers carried less weight now than they once had. She had built a reputation strong enough to stand on its own, separate from anything Damien Ashford had said about her on that miserable night. She thought of him rarely now, which surprised her more than anything else. The ache of the broken bond had faded into something distant and manageable, a scar rather than an open wound. She had heard, through the various channels that carried pack news across territories, that he had not taken another mate, that he remained unmarried and, by most accounts, colder and more withdrawn with each passing year. She felt no satisfaction in that. She simply felt nothing at all, which was its own kind of victory. What she did think of, more often than she expected to admit even to herself, was Kieran Ashford. He had become a regular presence at Blackthorn over the past 2 years, first under the excuse of border negotiations and trade agreements between Redwood and Blackthorn territories, then, as time went on, without much excuse at all. He would arrive with some minor pretext, a message that could easily have been sent by Ryder, a diplomatic matter that could have waited another month, and somehow he always found time to stop by the healing hall. "You've rearranged the shelves again," Kieran said, striding into the hall on a crisp autumn afternoon, shaking rain from his dark hair. He had grown into his role as alpha over the years they had known each other, broader through the shoulders, more certain in his bearing, but his eyes still held the same warm, easy humor she remembered from the day she stitched the wound in his side. "I organized them properly," Elena corrected, not looking up from the ledger she was updating. "There's a difference. Last time I visited, the burn salves were on the left. Last time you visited, the burn salves were in the wrong place, and I fixed it." He laughed, dropping into the chair across from her desk as though he had done it 100 times before, which, she realized, he essentially had. "How is the pack treating its healer these days?" "Busy. Old Enid Marsh's grandson broke his arm falling out of a tree, which took most of my morning, and Nora is convinced she has some rare illness that is, in fact, simply a common cold. The perils of leadership. My own pack has a similar problem. Half my warriors believe every scratch requires my personal attention. Because you insist on visiting every injured wolf yourself instead of trusting your own healers," Elena said, raising an eyebrow. "You'll wear yourself thin. Perhaps. But I find checking on my people myself tends to earn their loyalty more than sending someone else to do it." He studied her for a moment, something softer creeping into his expression. "You would understand that. You do the same thing." She did not answer immediately, unsettled slightly by how easily he read her, how naturally he understood the choices she made without needing them explained. It had become a familiar feeling over the past 2 years, this sense that Kieran Ashford saw her clearly, without the shadow of pity or judgment that colored so many other gazes. "How long are you staying this time?" she asked instead, changing the subject with practiced ease. "A few days. There's a matter of the eastern trade routes to discuss with your father, and I promised my mother I would check on an old friend of hers who lives near your territory." He paused, then added, almost carefully, "And I wanted to see you. That's not a diplomatic matter. Just an honest one." Elena felt warmth rise to her cheeks, an unfamiliar sensation after so long spent guarding herself against exactly this kind of vulnerability. She busied her hands with the ledger again, more to give herself something to do than because the work truly needed attention. "You could simply say that without the border negotiations as an excuse, you know?" "I could. But then your father might ask uncomfortable questions about why the Alpha of Redwood keeps finding reasons to visit his healer's daughter, and I thought it kinder to give him something official to write down in his records." She laughed despite herself, a real laugh, the kind that came easily and without effort, the kind she had not laughed in years before Kieran started visiting. It struck her, in that moment, how natural this had become, how much she looked forward to the sound of his voice in her hall, how the space around her chest, once so tight with grief, now felt open and light whenever he was near. They spent the rest of the afternoon in easy conversation, Kieran helping her sort a delivery of medicinal roots that had arrived that morning, listening with genuine interest as she explained the properties of each one, offering his own observations from Redwood's healing practices that occasionally taught her something new. It was, she realized somewhere in the middle of it, exactly the kind of partnership she had once believed she would never have, back when she stood broken in a fire-lit circle and watched a king walk away from her. That evening, after Kieran had gone to meet with her father about the trade routes, Marcus found her in the garden behind the healing hall, pulling weeds from between rows of chamomile with more focus than the task strictly required. "You're smiling," he observed, settling onto the low bench nearby. "You don't smile like that over weeds." "I like weeding." "Nobody likes weeding, Elena." He watched her for a moment, something knowing in his expression. "It's the Redwood Alpha, isn't it?" She did not bother denying it. Not to Marcus, who had known her long enough to see through any deflection she might attempt. "He's kind, Marcus. Genuinely kind. not the practiced kindness of someone performing for an audience. He listens. He remembers small things I've mentioned in passing. He treats me like my opinion matters. Because it does matter, Marcus said simply. You deserve someone who sees that. I never expected to feel anything like this again, she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of it. After the ceremony, I told myself I would build a life that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. I never imagined that life might include someone who made me feel this steady. Marcus was quiet for a moment, watching the last light fade behind the mountains. For what it's worth, I think you've earned every bit of this. You spent 2 years proving to an entire pack, and to yourself, that you were never the broken thing they whispered about. If Kieran Ashford sees that in you, then he's simply seeing the truth. Elena felt her throat tighten, unexpectedly moved by the simple sincerity of his words. Thank you, Marcus, for everything, for staying, when it would have been easier not to. You never had to thank me for that, he said quietly. You never will. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the wind move through the trees outside her window, Elena allowed herself, for the first time in 2 years, to imagine a future that felt genuinely bright. Not the future she had once pictured as a girl standing in a firelit circle, waiting for a bond that would never bring her happiness, but a new future entirely, one she was building with her own hands, one that might, if she allowed it, include a warm laugh and steady brown eyes that saw her exactly as she was. She did not yet know how far that future would carry her, or how completely it would change the course of 2 proud packs. She only knew, drifting towards sleep beneath a sky scattered with stars, that for the first time since the night of her rejection, hope no longer felt like a dangerous thing to hold. A wolf howled in warning somewhere along the eastern ridge, and Elena Voss dropped the basket of bandages she had been carrying, her heart lurching before she remembered that warning howls near the healing hall usually meant nothing more dangerous than a training accident. She was right. Within minutes, 2 young warriors half-carried, half-dragged a third between them through the door, the injured fighter clutching his shoulder with a grimace that suggested a dislocation rather than anything life-threatening. Elena directed them to a cot with the calm efficiency of someone who had handled 100 similar injuries, and within the hour the young man was sitting up, shoulder reset and bound, grumbling about how his training partner would never let him forget the embarrassment. It was a small crisis, easily resolved, the kind of afternoon that had become ordinary for Elena over the past months. What made this particular afternoon different was the visitor who arrived just as she finished cleaning her instruments, striding through the door with the easy confidence that had become so familiar to her. I heard there was excitement, Kieran said, glancing at the young warrior now being helped out of the hall by his friends. Should I be worried about the state of Blackthorn's training grounds? Only if you consider overconfidence a serious threat, Elena said, wiping down her work table. He tried to move above his skill level and paid for it. He'll live, and he'll be more careful next time. A lesson most of us learn the hard way at some point. Kieran leaned against the doorframe, watching her with the quiet attentiveness that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection. 6 months had passed since his injury had first brought them together, and in that time his visits to Blackthorn territory had grown from occasional to frequent enough that pack members had stopped remarking on them entirely, as though the Redwood Alpha's presence in Blackthorn's healing hall were simply an accepted part of the landscape. You didn't come all this way to discuss training accidents, Elena said, setting aside her cloth and giving him her full attention. No, he admitted. I came because the Border Council meets again next month, and I wanted to discuss something with you before that happens. He hesitated, an unusual thing for a man who typically spoke with easy confidence. There is a proposal being discussed, one that would formalize the alliance between Redwood and Blackthorn beyond simple trade agreements, a more permanent bond between our territories. Elena felt her chest tighten, uncertain where this conversation was heading. What kind of bond? The kind that would benefit both packs enormously, strengthening our defenses and our resources against any threat from beyond our borders. He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the slight nervousness beneath his usual composure, an expression she had never seen on him before. The Council has suggested a marriage between our packs would cement that alliance more firmly than any treaty. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them seemed prepared for. Elena's mind raced backward, unbidden, to another circle of firelight, another moment when her future had been decided by forces beyond her control, and she felt an old, familiar fear rise in her chest. And who does the Council suggest for this marriage? She asked carefully, though some part of her already suspected the answer, hoped for it even as she feared what it might mean. Me, Kieran said simply. And you, if you would have me. The silence that followed felt enormous, filled with 2 years of careful friendship, easy laughter, and a slow, steady warmth that Elena had never quite allowed herself to name. She studied his face, searching for any trace of the calculation she had seen in another alpha's eyes on the worst night of her life. Any sign that this was simply politics dressed up as affection. She found none. Only a genuine, quiet hope that made her chest ache in an entirely different way than fear. "Kieran," she said slowly, "I need to know something before I answer. Is this about the alliance, or is this about something else?" He crossed the remaining distance between them, taking her hands in his with a gentleness that steadied rather than overwhelmed her. "The council suggested the alliance. I am asking because of everything else. Because 2 years ago I walked into this hall with a wound in my side and found a woman more interesting than anyone I had met in my entire life. Because every excuse I have invented since then to visit Blackthorn territory has been exactly that, an excuse. When the truth is simply that I wanted to see you. Because I have never once in all our conversations felt the need to be anyone other than myself around you, and that is a rare enough gift that I refuse to let politics be the only reason we share a future." Elena's eyes stung with unexpected emotion, and she found herself laughing softly through it, an overwhelmed, disbelieving sound. "You've thought about this for a while. Longer than I probably should have before saying anything," he admitted. "I did not want to rush you, or make you feel pressured by something as significant as a formal alliance. But I also did not want to let this opportunity pass without telling you the truth of my feelings." "And if I say yes," Elena said carefully, "it would not simply be because the council wishes it. It would need to be because we both wanted this, for our own reasons, not only for the benefit of 2 packs. "That is exactly what I want," Kieran said. "A partnership built on choice, not obligation. I have seen enough unhappy alliances in my life to know the difference matters." Elena thought of the last time someone had stood before her discussing bonds and futures. The cold dismissal in golden eyes, the humiliation of being called unfit in front of an entire pack. She thought of how far she had come since then, the healing hall she had built, the reputation she had earned through her own effort, the quiet strength she had discovered in herself when no one else offered her comfort. And she thought of the 2 years since, filled with easy laughter and warm brown eyes, and a steady, growing certainty that this man, unlike the last, genuinely valued everything she was. "I need time to consider it properly," she said finally, and she saw a flicker of concern cross his face before she continued. "Not because I doubt my feelings, Kieran. Because the last time I entered into a bond without fully understanding what I was agreeing to, it nearly broke me. I want to be certain, for both our sakes, that I am choosing this with clear eyes." "That is more than fair," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Take whatever time you need. I am not going anywhere, and neither is my regard for you." She spent the following days in careful reflection, walking the ridge above the valley where she had once watched the sun set on the worst day of her life, sitting in quiet conversation with Marcus, who listened without judgment as she worked through every fear and hope tangled together in her chest. "You're afraid of being rejected again," Marcus observed one evening, as they sat together near the healing hall's garden. "Not by him specifically, by the idea of trusting a bond at all. Is that foolish?" "It's honest," Marcus said. "But Elena, you already know the difference between Kieran and Damien Ashford. You've spent 2 years learning it. The question isn't whether you're afraid. It's whether the fear is telling you something true, or simply something old." She turned his words over in her mind long after their conversation ended, and slowly, deliberately, she came to understand the answer for herself. The fear she carried belonged to the past, to a wound that had long since scarred over, not to the man who stood before her now offering his hand freely, without the coldness or contempt that had once defined her understanding of what an alpha's affection might look like. A week after Kieran's proposal, she sent word to Redwood territory, requesting his presence at Blackthorn once more. When he arrived, she met him in the healing hall's garden, the chamomile blooming quietly around them in the late afternoon light. "I've considered your proposal," she said, and watched him brace himself for disappointment, even as hope flickered in his eyes. "I want you to understand that my answer has nothing to do with alliances or councils, or the benefit of 2 territories. I am saying yes because of everything else you mentioned, because you have never once made me feel like anything less than an equal, because 2 years of your friendship have taught me what genuine care looks like, and I would be foolish to let fear stand between myself and a future built on that." The smile that broke across Kieran's face was unlike anything she had seen from him before, unguarded and radiant, and when he reached for her hands this time, she did not hesitate to let him take them. "Elena Voss," he said, "you have made me a genuinely happy man. Don't get too sentimental," she said, though her own smile betrayed her. "We still have an entire alliance to negotiate. Then let us negotiate it together," he said, "as equals, exactly as it should be. Word of their engagement spread through both territories within days, carried by riders and whispered conversations, reaching every corner of Redwood and Blackthorn alike. And though Elena knew, somewhere in the back of her mind, that the news would eventually reach the one man whose rejection had once defined the worst night of her life, she found, to her genuine surprise, that the thought no longer frightened her in the slightest. She had built her own future, on her own terms, with a man who valued every part of who she was. Whatever Damien Ashford felt upon hearing the news was no longer her concern to carry. The wine glass shattered against the stone hearth, and Damien Ashford stared at the scattered shards as though he could not quite explain how they had come to be there. He had not thrown it in anger, exactly. His hand had simply tightened around the stem without his notice, until the fragile glass gave way beneath his grip. And now he stood in the great hall of his estate, breathing harder than the situation seemed to warrant, staring at broken glass and spilled wine, while his mother watched him from across the room with an expression he did not care to examine too closely. "You've heard the news, then," said Lorraine Ashford, setting down the letter she had been reading, the one that had prompted this entire scene. "I've heard it," Damien said, his voice tighter than he intended. "Elena Voss and Kieran are to be married." His mother said the words plainly, without cruelty, though Damien felt each one land like a blow regardless. The Alliance Council is thrilled, of course. A formal bond between Redwood and Blackthorn would strengthen both territories considerably. "I am aware of the political benefits, Mother. I do not need them explained to me." "I did not think you needed the political benefits explained," Lorraine said, studying her son with the kind of patient, knowing look that had unsettled him since childhood, the look that suggested she saw straight through whatever composure he attempted to maintain. "I thought perhaps you needed to sit with the fact that the woman you rejected 2 years ago is about to become Luna of Redwood, and that this news seems to have disturbed you considerably more than a simple political matter should." Damien said nothing, bending instead to gather the broken glass from the floor, using the task as an excuse to avoid his mother's gaze. It did not disturb him. He had told himself repeatedly, over the past 2 years, that his decision on the night of the moon ceremony had been the correct one, the rational one, the choice any alpha king in his position would have made given the circumstances. Elena Voss had been the daughter of a lesser beta, untrained in leadership, unprepared for the demands of ruling beside a king. He had done what was necessary for his pack, and necessity did not leave room for regret. Except, lately, it had. He had heard fragments of news about her over the past 2 years, carried by traders and border patrols who had no idea their casual mentions of Blackthorn's rising young healer meant anything at all to their alpha king. He had heard that she rebuilt the healing hall from a single cramped cabin into a proper stone building respected across territories. He had heard that packmates who once whispered about her rejection now called her Healer Voss, with genuine deference. He had heard, more recently and with considerably more unease, that the Redwood Alpha had taken to visiting Blackthorn territory with unusual frequency, always with some diplomatic excuse that fooled absolutely no one who paid attention. He had told himself none of it mattered. He had told himself, repeatedly, that whatever life Elena Voss built for herself was no concern of his, that the rejected bond between them had severed cleanly and permanently, and that any lingering discomfort he felt when her name came up in conversation was simply the natural, temporary irritation of unfinished business, rather than anything approaching genuine feeling. The engagement announcement made that particular lie considerably harder to maintain. "You look troubled, my son," his mother said, her voice softer now, less pointed than before. "I have watched you carry something heavy since that night at the moon ceremony, though you have never once spoken of it honestly, not even to me." "There is nothing to speak of," Damien said, straightening with the broken glass gathered in his hand. "I made a decision that benefited this pack. The decision stands. Whatever Elena Voss does with her life afterward is entirely her own business." "Is that truly all you feel?" Lorraine asked, and there was no accusation in the question, only a genuine, searching curiosity that Damien found harder to deflect than outright criticism would have been. "Because I recall a young man who came to me the morning after that ceremony, insisting he felt nothing, and yet I also recall that same young man refusing every potential match presented to him since, dismissing every candidate the council suggested with excuses that grew flimsier each time." Damien set the broken glass on a nearby table, unwilling to meet his mother's eyes. "I have simply not found a suitable match. Or," Lorraine said gently, "you rejected the one bond fate offered you, and some part of you has been unable to move past that decision ever since, however loudly you insist otherwise." He wanted to argue, wanted to produce some rational explanation that would put the matter to rest entirely, but the words would not come. He thought instead, unbidden, of the moon ceremony itself, of Elena's face in the firelight, trembling but proud, refusing to let him see her break even as he delivered the cruelest words he had ever spoken to another living soul. He thought of the way she had lifted her chin and told him she would not chase a man who did not want her, and how, at the time, he had mistaken her composure for indifference rather than what it truly was, a woman refusing to grant him the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. He had convinced himself, in the 2 years since, that his choice had been about her unsuitability, her lack of training, her lesser standing within the pack hierarchy. He had never once allowed himself to examine the possibility that his choice had been about something else entirely, something closer to fear than to reason. "Even if you are correct," he said finally, his voice quieter than before, "the matter is settled now. She is to marry Kieran. There is nothing left to reconsider." "No," his mother agreed. "There is nothing left to reconsider regarding the bond itself, but there is a great deal left for you to reconsider about yourself, Damien, if you intend to spend the rest of your reign as cold and solitary as you have been these past 2 years. She left him alone with that thought, and Damien stood for a long while in the empty hall, staring at the space where the broken glass had fallen, feeling something uncomfortable and unfamiliar settling in his chest, something he was not yet ready to name. Word of the engagement reached Redwood Territory's allies and neighbors quickly, as such news always did, and among the many pack leaders who received formal invitations to the upcoming bonding ceremony was, inevitably, Damien Ashford himself. Alliance custom demanded his attendance, given the significance of the union between Redwood and Blackthorn, and he found himself staring at the elegant invitation for a long time before finally setting it aside, unable to decide whether the tightness in his chest was dread or something else entirely. Meanwhile, in Redwood Territory, Kieran Ashford received the news of his best friend's reaction through a mutual acquaintance who had witnessed the shattered wine glass and Lorraine's pointed conversation, and he found himself troubled by it in ways he had not anticipated. "He's struggling with the engagement," Kieran said to his sister, Priya, as they walked the training grounds together one afternoon. "More than I expected him to." "Should that surprise you?" Priya asked, raising an eyebrow. "He rejected his own fated mate 2 years ago, and now watches his closest friend marry her. That would trouble anyone, regardless of how coldly he behaves about it." "I don't want this to come between us," Kieran admitted. "Damien has been like a brother to me since we were children. I never intended for this situation to create distance between us." "Then perhaps you should speak with him directly," Priya suggested, "rather than allowing assumptions and pride to grow into something neither of you can easily undo." Kieran considered her advice carefully, and within days he traveled to Blackthorn Territory not to visit Elena, but to seek out Damien himself, finding him in the private study of the Ashford estate, staring at maps of the Northern Territories with an intensity that suggested his mind was elsewhere entirely. "I wanted to speak with you honestly," Kieran said, closing the door behind him. "Before the ceremony, before this becomes something unspoken between us that festers over time." Damien looked up, something guarded crossing his expression. "There is nothing to discuss, Kieran. You have chosen to marry a woman I once rejected. The choice is entirely yours to make, and I have no claim over her future." "That is not quite what I asked you to discuss," Kieran said, settling into the chair across from him. "I asked whether you are truly at peace with this, because I have known you long enough to recognize when you are not, and I would rather hear the truth from you now than watch you carry silent resentment into a future where our packs are meant to be allies." Damien was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the cold certainty he usually wielded so effortlessly. "I made my decision that night believing it was the correct one. I still believe in many ways that it was the correct decision for my pack at that time. But I have watched her, from a distance, become someone remarkable in the years since, and some part of me has begun to wonder whether I mistook fear for reason on that night, and whether I have spent 2 years justifying a cruelty I no longer fully understand." Kieran studied his old friend carefully, surprised by the honesty of the admission. "That is more truth than I expected from you." "It is more truth than I have allowed myself to admit, even privately," Damien said. "But hear me clearly, Kieran. Whatever regret I carry is mine alone to manage. I have no intention of standing between your engagement, and I certainly have no intention of allowing old feelings, however complicated, to damage our friendship. You deserve happiness, and from what I have observed, Elena deserves it as well. I will attend your ceremony, offer my genuine congratulations, and find a way to make peace with the consequences of my own choices. I appreciate that more than you know," Kieran said quietly. "You are still my closest friend, Damien, regardless of how this situation unfolds. I would not wish for that to change." "It will not," Damien said, though the words cost him more effort than he expected. I only ask that you give me time to reconcile myself fully with everything this engagement forces me to confront. Kieran nodded, satisfied for the moment, though as he rode back toward Blackthorn territory that evening, he found himself wondering whether his old friend's newfound honesty represented genuine acceptance, or simply the first crack in a wall that had been holding back something far more complicated than either of them had yet allowed themselves to fully examine. A single silver needle trembled in Elena Voss's hand, and for a woman who had stitched 100 wounds without hesitation, the sight of her own fingers shaking over a piece of embroidery struck her as almost comical. "You've undone that same stitch 4 times, said Nora Callahan, sitting across the small workroom with a length of pale blue fabric spread across her lap. "Are you nervous?" "I am not nervous," Elena said, setting the needle down with more force than necessary. "I am simply concerned about getting the pattern correct. The pattern is for a ceremonial sash that no one will examine closely enough to notice a slightly imperfect stitch," Nora pointed out, amusement clear in her voice. "You are nervous. It is perfectly natural before a bonding ceremony, Elena. Even the calmest brides feel it." Elena allowed herself a small, rueful smile, setting the embroidery aside entirely. The bonding ceremony was 2 weeks away now, close enough that preparations had consumed nearly every spare hour of her days, from fittings for the ceremonial dress to endless discussions with pack elders about the specific rituals that would unite Redwood and Blackthorn officially. It was, by every measure, the happiest occasion she had experienced in years, and yet a persistent thread of anxiety wound through her chest regardless, one she found difficult to fully explain even to herself. "It isn't only nerves," she admitted finally. "I keep thinking of the last time I stood in a circle waiting for a bond to be recognized. I know this is different, Nora. I know Kieran is nothing like what came before, but some part of me still braces for the worst, even now." Nora set down her own sewing, her expression softening. "That makes sense, Elena, given everything you endured. But you must remember, the man waiting for you this time chose you freely, with his eyes open, knowing exactly who you are, and valuing every part of it. That is not the same situation at all, however much old fear might whisper otherwise." "I know that logically," Elena said. "I am simply learning to feel it as certainly as I know it." Kieran found her later that evening in the Healing Hall's garden, tending to the chamomile with the same quiet focus she often used to settle her thoughts. He said nothing at first, simply settling onto the bench beside her, watching the last light fade behind the mountains that separated their 2 territories. "Nora tells me you've been anxious about the ceremony," he said eventually, his voice gentle rather than concerned. "Nora talks too much," Elena said, though there was no real irritation in it. "She talks because she cares about you," Kieran said. "As do I, which is why I want to ask you directly, rather than let assumptions grow between us. Are you having doubts, Elena? About us? About this marriage? If you are, I would rather know now than watch you walk into that circle carrying fears you have not voiced." Elena set down her gardening tools and turned to face him fully, appreciating, not for the first time, how directly he approached difficult conversations rather than allowing them to fester unspoken. "I have no doubts about you, Kieran. None whatsoever. My hesitation has nothing to do with whether I want this marriage, and everything to do with old wounds that occasionally ache, even after they've healed. I trust you completely. I simply have not yet fully trusted the world to be kind to me again, not after everything that came before." "That is fair," Kieran said, taking her hand gently, "and I do not expect that fear to disappear overnight simply because I ask it to. I only want you to know that whatever happens on the day of our ceremony, and every day afterward, I intend to prove myself worthy of your trust, again and again, for as long as it takes." "You already have," Elena said softly, and found, to her own quiet relief, that she meant it entirely. The day of the bonding ceremony arrived beneath a clear autumn sky, the kind of crisp golden afternoon that seemed almost designed for celebration. Blackthorn territory had transformed for the occasion, the training grounds cleared and decorated with garlands of late-season flowers, long tables arranged for the feast that would follow the formal rites. Representatives from both Redwood and Blackthorn gathered in numbers far exceeding anything Elena had witnessed since the moon ceremony 2 years earlier. She stood in a private tent near the ceremonial circle, watching Nora and Grace fuss over the final adjustments to her dress, a deep green gown embroidered with silver thread that caught the afternoon light beautifully. It was nothing like the simple white dress she had worn on the night of her rejection, and she found a quiet satisfaction in that difference, as though the color itself marked how far she had traveled since then. "You look radiant," Grace said, stepping back to admire her work. "Truly, Elena, I have never seen you look more certain of yourself." "I feel certain," Elena said, and realized as she spoke the words that they were entirely true. Whatever fear had lingered in the days before had settled into something quieter now, overshadowed by a steady confidence in the choice she was about to make. Her father appeared at the tent entrance a short while later, dressed formally for the occasion, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of pride and something that looked almost like regret. "Elena," he said, "you look beautiful." "Thank you, father." He hesitated, clearly working up to something difficult to say. "I have not always handled the past 2 years as well as I should have. I distanced myself when you needed support, out of some misguided concern for how the pack perceived our family, and I have regretted that, more than I have ever properly told you." Elena felt her throat tighten, surprised by the sincerity of the admission. "Thank you for saying that. I am proud of you," Aldrich continued, his voice rougher than usual. "Prouder than I have ever adequately expressed. You built something remarkable out of the worst night of your life, and today you marry a man who recognizes your worth entirely. Whatever mistakes I made in the past, know that I see you clearly now, and I am deeply proud to walk you to that circle." She embraced him, unable to find words adequate to the moment, and when he offered his arm a short while later to walk her toward the ceremonial circle, she took it with a lightness in her chest that had been absent for a very long time. The circle itself was breathtaking, framed by garlands and lanterns despite the daylight hour, packed with representatives from both territories eager to witness the formal union between Redwood and Blackthorn. Kieran stood waiting at the center, dressed in deep forest green that matched her own gown, his expression carrying none of the coldness she remembered from another ceremony years earlier, only warm, unguarded joy at the sight of her approaching. The pack elder presiding over the rites, an elderly woman named Edith Barrow, known across both territories for her wisdom, began the ceremony with the traditional words binding two packs together, and Elena found herself listening with genuine attention, rather than the numb dread she remembered from the last time she stood in a similar circle. "Do you, Kieran Ashford, Alpha of Redwood, choose this bond freely, with clear eyes and an open heart, to stand beside Elena Voss as her equal and partner for all the years to come?" "I do," Kieran said, his voice steady and certain, his eyes never leaving hers. "Freely, and with more gratitude than I can properly express." "And do you, Elena Voss, choose this bond freely, with clear eyes and an open heart, to stand beside Kieran Ashford as his equal and partner for all the years to come?" Elena felt the weight of the entire circle's attention, the same weight that had once crushed her beneath humiliation, and found, to her own quiet triumph, that it no longer frightened her at all. "I do," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "freely, and with a heart I once believed I would never trust again." The ceremony concluded with the traditional binding, a simple exchange of woven cords around their joined wrists, symbolizing the union of their two territories, and as the pack elder pronounced them formally bonded, a cheer rose from the gathered crowd that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. Elena felt tears sting her eyes, not from grief this time, but from an overwhelming, joyful relief that the future she had once feared was lost to her forever had, in fact, simply been waiting for the right partner to help her find it. Somewhere near the edge of the circle, standing among the Redwood delegation required by Alliance custom to attend, Damian Ashford watched the ceremony with an expression few in attendance noticed, too caught up in the celebration to observe their Alpha King's careful, guarded stillness. He had told himself, repeatedly, that he would attend this ceremony with genuine grace, that he would offer his congratulations honestly and find peace with the consequences of choices made 2 years earlier. He had not anticipated how deeply the sight of Elena, radiant and certain in a way he had never once seen her during their brief acquaintance, would settle into his chest like a stone. She had never looked at him the way she now looked at Kieran. She had never once, in the short and cruel time they shared a bond, had the opportunity to look at him that way, because he had severed the connection before either of them ever discovered what it might have become. He clapped along with the rest of the crowd when the ceremony concluded, offered his congratulations to Kieran, with what he hoped passed for genuine warmth, and found himself, throughout the celebration that followed, unable to look away from the woman he had once dismissed so carelessly, now radiant and whole, and utterly, irrevocably beyond his reach. The feast tables groaned under the weight of roasted meat and autumn harvest dishes, and laughter rolled across the Blackthorn training grounds long into the evening. But Damian Ashford sat apart from the celebration, nursing a cup of cider he had no real interest in drinking. "You've barely spoken all evening," said his mother, settling into the seat beside him with the quiet directness that had always been her way. Lorraine Ashford had insisted on attending the ceremony herself, despite her son's initial suggestion that her presence was unnecessary, and now she watched him with the same searching attention she had shown him weeks earlier over a shattered wineglass. I have spoken plenty, Damien said. I offered my congratulations. I danced with the appropriate diplomatic partners. I have fulfilled every obligation this ceremony required of me. You have performed every obligation, his mother corrected gently. That is not the same as genuine participation, and I think you know that as well as I do. Damien said nothing, his eyes drifting despite himself toward the center of the celebration, where Elena stood laughing at something Kieran had said, her hand resting easily in his, the two of them surrounded by well-wishers from both territories. She looked entirely at home in that role, entirely certain of herself in a way that struck him as remarkable, given how thoroughly he had once tried to convince her, and everyone watching, that she was unfit for exactly this kind of position. I was wrong about her, he said finally, the words escaping before he had fully decided to speak them aloud. I know, his mother said simply. I convinced myself, that night, that my decision was rooted in reason, that she lacked the training, the standing, the strength required to stand beside an alpha king. I have watched, over these past 2 years, everything she has built with her own hands, and I can no longer pretend my judgment that night had anything to do with her shortcomings at all. What did it have to do with, then? Lorraine asked, her voice carrying no judgment, only genuine curiosity. Damien was quiet for a long moment, watching Elena laugh again at something else Kieran said, watching the easy warmth between them, that he had never once offered her himself. I think, he said finally, that I was afraid. Afraid of what it would mean to belong entirely to someone else, to place my own vulnerability in another person's hands, and trust they would not use it against me. It was easier to reject the bond before it had the chance to matter, than to risk discovering how much it might have mattered, and how badly I might have failed at protecting it. That is more self-awareness than I expected to hear from you tonight, his mother said, something gentle in her expression. What do you intend to do with that understanding now, Damien? The bond is severed. She has built a life, and a marriage, entirely separate from you. There is no undoing any of that. I know, Damien said, and the words carried a weight of finality that surprised even him. I have no intention of disrupting her happiness, or Kieran's, or the alliance this marriage represents. Whatever regret I carry is mine to manage, not a burden I intend to place on either of them. Then what will you do? Lorraine pressed gently. I will learn from it, Damien said, watching the celebration continue around him, the easy joy that Elena had found without him, the partnership she had built with a man who valued her from the very beginning, rather than only after 2 years of watching her succeed from a careful distance. I will not make the same mistake again, should fate ever offer me another chance at a genuine bond, and I will find a way to be genuinely happy for my closest friend, rather than allowing bitterness to poison a friendship that has meant more to me than almost anything else in my life. His mother studied him for a long moment, then reached over and squeezed his hand, an unusually tender gesture from a woman who typically expressed affection through pointed observations rather than physical warmth. That is a wiser response than I expected from you, my son. Growth often looks exactly like this. Painful, honest, and entirely necessary. Later that evening, as the celebration began winding down and guests started drifting toward the guest quarters prepared for them, Damien found himself walking the edge of the training grounds alone, the sounds of laughter and music fading behind him. He was surprised, therefore, when he turned a corner near the healing hall and found Elena standing there alone as well, having apparently stepped away from the festivities for a moment of quiet. They stood facing each other for a long, uncertain moment, the last time either of them had spoken privately stretching back 2 years, to a night neither of them had likely forgotten, despite everything that had changed since. Congratulations, Damien said finally, his voice careful and measured. Genuinely, Kieran is fortunate, and I mean that with complete sincerity. Thank you, Elena said, her own voice steady, carrying none of the tremor he remembered from the last time they had spoken directly to one another. That means something, coming from you, whatever complicated history stands between us. He nodded, hesitating before continuing, aware that whatever he said next might matter more than anything he had spoken in years. I owe you an apology, Elena. 2 years overdue, and likely insufficient given the harm I caused that night, but I would like to offer it regardless, if you are willing to hear it. Elena studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before finally nodding once. I am willing to listen. I was wrong about you, Damien said, the words costing him more than she likely realized. Wrong about your training, your strength, your worthiness to stand beside an alpha. I told myself that night that my decision was rational, but I have watched you these past 2 years build something remarkable entirely through your own effort, and I can no longer maintain the lie that my judgment that night had anything to do with genuine shortcomings on your part. I was afraid, Elena. afraid of the vulnerability a true bond demands, and it was easier, in that moment, to reject you than to risk discovering what that vulnerability might have required of me. I am deeply sorry for the cruelty of how I delivered that rejection, and for the pain it caused you, both that night and in the months that followed. Elena was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully before she spoke. Thank you for saying that, Damien. It matters more than you might expect, hearing you acknowledge it honestly, rather than continuing to justify it as necessity. Does it change anything? He asked, and immediately regretted the question, recognizing even as he spoke it how unfair it was to ask. No, Elena said gently, but without cruelty. It does not change anything, Damien, and I think you already know that. I am married now, to a man I love completely, who has never once made me question my own worth. Your apology does not undo what happened, and it certainly does not create space for anything beyond what already exists between us. But it does allow me to release whatever bitterness I still carried, and for that, I am genuinely grateful. That is more than I deserve, Damien admitted. Perhaps, Elena said. But I have learned, over the past 2 years, that holding on to anger serves no one, least of all myself. I forgive you, Damien, not because your actions were acceptable, but because I no longer wish to carry the weight of that night any further into my future. I hope you find whatever peace you are searching for as well. She turned to walk back toward the celebration, then paused, glancing back at him once more. For what it's worth, I hope you find someone who teaches you that vulnerability is not a weakness to fear, but a strength worth risking everything for. You deserve that, whatever happened between us. She left him standing alone near the healing hall, the sounds of celebration drifting faintly from the training grounds beyond, and Damien found himself, for the first time in 2 years, feeling something closer to genuine peace than he had expected possible. He had lost what might have been, through his own choices, on a night he could never undo. But watching Elena Voss walk back toward her husband, toward a life she had built entirely through her own strength and resilience, he found himself hoping, with a sincerity that surprised him, that her happiness would last for every remaining day of her life. Whatever came next for himself, he understood now, would have to be built the same way she had built her own future. Through honest effort, through genuine vulnerability, and through the courage to risk everything rather than protect himself from ever feeling anything at all. Smoke rose over the eastern ridge of Redwood territory, and Elena Ashford was already reaching for her healing kit before the warning horn finished sounding. 6 months had passed since her bonding ceremony, 6 months of settling into her new role as Luna of Redwood, learning the rhythms of a pack larger and more spread out than the one she had grown up in, earning the trust of warriors and healers alike, through the same steady, tireless work that had once rebuilt Blackthorn's healing hall from nothing. She had believed, until this particular morning, that the hardest part of her transition was behind her. Rogue wolves, Kieran said grimly, striding into their quarters already half-dressed in his fighting leathers, his expression sharper and more focused than Elena had ever seen it. A pack of them crossed the northern boundary before dawn, burned 2 grain stores, and wounded several of our border patrol before retreating. My warriors are mobilizing now. How many wounded? Elena asked, already moving toward the door, her mind shifting into the familiar, focused calm that years of healing work had trained into her. At least 6, possibly more by the time the full patrol reports in. Kieran caught her arm gently before she could leave, his expression tightening with concern. Elena, this is not a training accident. Rogue wolves fighting a coordinated attack are dangerous, and there is a chance they return before the day is finished. Then you will need every healer available prepared for that possibility, Elena said firmly, meeting his eyes without hesitation. I am not asking your permission to do my work, Kieran. I am telling you I intend to be ready when those wounded warriors arrive. Something flickered across his face, worry mixed with unmistakable pride, and he nodded once. Then let us move quickly. The healing hall of Redwood territory transformed within the hour into a scene of controlled urgency, warriors carrying their wounded comrades through the doors as Elena and the pack's other healers worked in swift, practiced coordination. She had trained her whole life for exactly this kind of crisis, and she moved through it now with a steadiness that impressed even the most experienced healers working alongside her, cleaning wounds, setting bones, calming frightened young warriors who had never faced real combat before that morning. It was well into the afternoon when a second warning horn sounded, sharper and more urgent than the first, and word spread quickly through the healing hall that the rogue wolves had indeed returned, this time in greater numbers, testing Redwood's borders more aggressively than before. Elena felt her heart clench with fear, not for herself, but for Kieran, who had ridden out with his warriors hours earlier to reinforce the border patrol. She forced the fear down, focusing instead on the wounded still requiring her attention. trusting that the man she had married was as capable and steady in battle as he was in every other aspect of his leadership. The hours that followed stretched into some of the longest of her life, filled with the steady work of treating wounded warriors as they trickled back from the border in twos and threes, each arrival bringing fresh reports of the fighting, each report leaving her chest tighter with worry she refused to let interfere with her work. When Kieran himself finally returned as the sun began sinking toward the western peaks, exhausted and bearing a shallow cut across his forearm but otherwise unharmed, Elena felt relief flood through her so powerfully that her hands trembled as she cleaned and bandaged the wound. "The rogues have retreated fully," Kieran told her, wincing slightly as she worked. "Driven back across the northern boundary. It will take some time to determine exactly what provoked this attack, but for now, the immediate threat has passed." "You frightened me," Elena admitted quietly, focusing on her work rather than meeting his eyes. "I do not think I have ever felt fear like that, waiting to know whether you would return safely." "I am sorry for that," Kieran said gently, reaching up to still her hands, forcing her to look at him. "But Elena, watching you work today, coordinating the healing hall with such calm authority, treating warrior after warrior with steady hands despite your own fear, only confirmed everything I already believed about you. You are exactly the partner I need standing beside me, in crisis as much as in peace." That evening, once the healing hall had quieted and the last of the wounded had been settled comfortably for the night, Elena and Kieran sat together on the small balcony outside their quarters, watching stars emerge over the mountains that separated Redwood from Blackthorn territory. "Today reminded me of something," Elena said quietly, leaning into his shoulder. "When I first began healing, back at Blackthorn, I told myself I was building a life that depended on no one else's approval. I never imagined that life might eventually include standing beside someone in a genuine crisis, trusting each other completely to do our respective parts." "And now," Kieran asked, "now I understand that partnership does not mean losing the strength I built on my own," Elena said. "It means having someone who values that strength enough to trust it completely, even when circumstances are frightening. You have never once tried to shield me from difficult work, Kieran, and I love you for that as much as for anything else." He kissed the top of her head gently, and they sat together in comfortable silence for a long while, the aftermath of the day's crisis settling into something like peace between them. News of the rogue wolf attack and of Redwood's successful defense would spread quickly through both territories in the days that followed, and among the many messages of concern and support that arrived at Redwood's gates was one Elena had not entirely expected. A letter from Damian Ashford, brief and formal in tone, offering Blackthorn's full military support should Redwood require additional reinforcement against further rogue incursions, along with a personal note expressing genuine relief that both Kieran and Elena had emerged from the crisis unharmed. "He's trying," Kieran observed, reading the letter over her shoulder. "In his own careful way." "He is," Elena agreed, folding the letter thoughtfully. "I think, for the first time since I've known him, he is genuinely trying to become someone better than the man who stood in that circle 2 years ago." "Does that trouble you?" "No," Elena said, and found, examining her own heart honestly, that she meant it entirely. "I hope he succeeds, Kieran, not for my sake, but for his own. Everyone deserves the chance to grow beyond their worst moments, provided they are willing to do the difficult work that growth requires." The following weeks brought a steady rebuilding to the border communities damaged by the rogue attack, Elena's healing hall working alongside Redwood's warriors and builders to restore what had been lost. She found, in the aftermath of that crisis, a new confidence in her position as Luna, no longer simply the woman who had married into Redwood's leadership, but a partner who had proven herself capable in the moments that mattered most. It was during this period of rebuilding that word reached Redwood territory of another significant development, one that would soon draw the threads of this story back toward the man whose rejection had once defined the worst night of Elena's life, and whose slow, painful growth in the years since had begun to reshape the future of all 3 territories involved. A rider arrived at Redwood's gates just after dawn, her horse lathered from hard travel, carrying news that spread through the territory faster than the morning fog burning off the mountainside. Damian Ashford had named a new beta to lead alongside him, a decision that surprised absolutely no one who had watched the Northern Territories closely over the past year, though the reasons behind the decision surprised a great many people once the full story emerged. Elena heard the news from Kieran himself, who had received a personal letter from his old friend, explaining the circumstances, before the formal announcement reached other territories. She sat across from him in their private study, listening as he read portions of the letter aloud, her expression shifting from curiosity to genuine warmth as the story unfolded. He met her nearly a year ago, Kieran explained, setting the letter down. Isla Ferris, a warrior from one of Blackthorn's smaller allied clans, skilled enough in strategy that she caught his attention during a border dispute negotiation. He writes that she challenged his assumptions constantly, refused to simply agree with his judgments the way most of his advisors had grown accustomed to doing, and that her honesty forced him to examine himself more carefully than he had in years. That sounds like exactly what he needed, Elena said, genuine warmth in her voice. Someone unwilling to simply defer to him. He says as much himself, Kieran continued, scanning further down the letter. He writes that he nearly repeated his old patterns with her, nearly let fear convince him to maintain distance rather than risk genuine vulnerability, but that watching our marriage these past months, watching how we built something real through mutual respect rather than hierarchy, gave him the courage to approach things differently this time. Elena felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest, a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with old grievances, and everything to do with genuine hope for a man who had spent so long punishing himself for a single cruel decision made out of fear. I am glad, Kieran. Truly glad. He deserves the chance to build something real, the same as we did. There is one more thing, Kieran said, a slight smile touching his lips. He has requested our presence at their formal courtship ceremony next month, should we be willing to attend. He writes that your presence specifically would mean a great deal to him, as a sign that whatever happened between you has been genuinely put to rest. Elena considered the request carefully, examining her own heart for any lingering trace of old pain before answering. She found, to her quiet satisfaction, only genuine goodwill remaining, the last vestiges of old hurt having fully healed into simple, uncomplicated peace. I would be glad to attend, she said finally. It seems a fitting way to close this particular chapter, don't you think? Watching him build the kind of genuine partnership he once denied himself, the same way we built ours. The courtship ceremony, held a month later beneath the same mountains where Elena had once stood trembling through her own rejection, carried an entirely different atmosphere than that long-ago night. Damien stood at the center of the circle beside Isla Ferris, a sharp-eyed, confident woman, whose expression carried none of the deference the old moon ceremony traditions typically demanded, and whose easy confidence in addressing her intended partner as an equal, rather than a subordinate, suggested exactly the kind of partnership Damien had described in his letter. Elena watched the ceremony from among the gathered crowd, Kieran's hand steady in hers, and found herself unexpectedly moved by the sight of Damien speaking his vows with genuine warmth, rather than the cold formality she remembered from years earlier. Whatever fear had once driven him to reject vulnerability so cruelly, seemed, in this moment, to have genuinely loosened its grip. After the ceremony concluded and the celebration began in earnest, Damien approached Elena and Kieran directly, his expression carrying a mixture of gratitude and lingering uncertainty that she had come to recognize as genuine, rather than performed. Thank you for coming, he said, his eyes meeting Elena's with a steadiness that would have been impossible for him years earlier. It means more than you likely realize. I am genuinely happy for you, Damien, Elena said, and meant every word of it. Isla seems remarkable. I hope you build something lasting together. I intend to try, Damien said. I have learned, watching you and Kieran these past months, that genuine partnership requires a kind of courage I spent years avoiding. I am attempting to be braver now, however uncomfortable that bravery sometimes feels. That is all any of us can do, Elena said gently. I wish you both every happiness, Damien, truly. He nodded, something like relief passing across his features, and excused himself to rejoin his own celebration, leaving Elena and Kieran standing together near the edge of the circle where her own future had once been so cruelly decided. You seem lighter, Kieran observed, studying her face carefully. Watching that ceremony. I am lighter, Elena admitted. I think some small part of me needed to see him build something genuine, needed proof that whatever happened between us served some purpose beyond simple cruelty. Watching him choose vulnerability, finally, after everything, feels like the last piece of healing I did not know I still needed. And how do you feel now? Kieran asked, drawing her closer as the celebration continued around them. Complete, Elena said simply, resting her head against his shoulder, as the mountains stood silent witness above them. The same peaks that had watched her worst humiliation, now watching an entirely different story unfold, one built on genuine choice, mutual respect, and the slow, hard-won courage to trust again, after everything that had come before. The alliance between Redwood, Blackthorn, and the smaller allied territories connected through Isla's clan grew stronger in the months that followed, strengthened not merely by formal treaties and trade agreements, but by the genuine goodwill that had grown between three pack leaders who had each, in their own way, learned the difficult lesson that true strength required vulnerability rather than avoiding it. 3 years after a trembling girl stood alone in a firelit circle and heard the word no shatter her entire future, Elena Ashford stood in that same region of the northern mountains, though everything about her circumstances had transformed so completely that the memory felt almost like it belonged to someone else entirely. The healing hall she had established at Redwood Territory now rivaled the one she had built at Blackthorn years earlier, staffed by a growing number of apprentices she had personally trained, respected across every allied territory for the quality of care it provided. She had recently begun traveling between Redwood and Blackthorn regularly, teaching healing techniques to apprentices in both territories, strengthening the bonds between the packs through the same steady, practical work that had once been her only refuge during the darkest period of her life. "You've built something remarkable," Grace Doyle told her during one such visit, watching Elena instruct a group of young apprentices in proper wound cleaning techniques, with the same patient thoroughness Grace herself had once shown her. "I remember teaching you these very techniques, not so many years ago, in a cramped little cabin that could barely hold 2 people comfortably." "I remember it too," Elena said, smiling at the memory. "I could not have imagined, standing in that cabin, everything that would eventually come from those early lessons." "None of us could have imagined it," Grace said, "least of all on that terrible night at the moon ceremony. But perhaps that is the nature of true resilience, Elena. It rarely announces itself in the moment. It simply builds, quietly, one difficult day after another, until eventually you look back and realize how far you have traveled." Elena thought of those words often in the months that followed, particularly as she settled into the rhythms of a life that had grown richer and fuller than she ever believed possible during those dark early days after her rejection. Her marriage to Kieran had deepened steadily, built on the same foundation of mutual respect and genuine partnership that had drawn her to him in the first place, strengthened further by the shared crisis of the rogue wolf attack, and countless smaller challenges they had navigated together since. Her relationship with her father had healed as well, slowly and imperfectly, but genuinely. Aldrich visiting Redwood Territory regularly now, taking obvious pride in the healing hall his daughter had built, in the respect she commanded across 3 allied territories, in the granddaughter she and Kieran welcomed into the world during the autumn of their 2nd year of marriage, a bright-eyed girl they named Wren, after the wildflowers that grew along the ridge where Elena had once watched sunsets alone during her darkest days. Even her relationship with Damien had settled into something genuinely peaceful, the careful, formal warmth of allied leaders who had once shared a complicated history but had each, in their own time, grown into people capable of mutual respect, rather than lingering bitterness. His marriage to Isla had produced its own strengthening effect on the Northern Alliance, the 3 territories now bound together by treaties, trade, and genuine friendship in a way that had seemed impossible during the tense years following Elena's rejection. On a warm spring evening nearly 4 years after the moon ceremony that had once threatened to define her entire life, Elena stood on the balcony of her home in Redwood Territory, watching Kieran play with their young daughter in the garden below, laughing at something Wren had said with the same easy warmth that had first drawn Elena to him years earlier. Marcus had visited that week as well, now serving as beta to a neighboring territory himself, still as steady and loyal a friend as he had been during the darkest days of her rejection, and his own recent engagement to a healer from his new territory had brought Elena genuine joy, knowing that the kindness he had shown her during her worst moments had eventually found its own reward. She thought, watching the scene below her, of the girl who had once stood trembling in that firelit circle, certain that a single cruel word had destroyed every hope she carried for her future. That girl could never have imagined this life, this garden, this daughter, this steady, loving partnership built through years of honest effort, rather than a single fated moment. Perhaps, Elena had come to understand, that was the deeper truth hidden within her own story. Fate had offered her one bond, and that bond had shattered before it ever had the chance to become anything real. But in the aftermath of that shattering, she had built something far more valuable than any bond assigned by chance alone, a life shaped entirely by her own resilience, her own choices, and the genuine partnership she had found with a man who valued her completely, precisely because she had never needed him to complete her in the first place. The rejection that had once felt like the ending of everything had, in fact, simply been the doorway to a life Elena would never have discovered any other way. She had built her own worth long before Kieran ever recognized it, had proven her strength to herself before she ever needed anyone else to confirm it, and had learned, through years of difficult, patient work, that the truest partnerships were built not from fate's careless assignment, but from the deliberate, ongoing choice 2 people made to value and support each other, day after day, long after the first spark of attraction had settled into something steadier and far more lasting. As the sun set behind the mountains that had witnessed both her deepest humiliation and her greatest happiness, Elena Ashford smiled, content in the knowledge that whatever came next for her family, her healing hall, and the alliance she had helped strengthen between three proud territories, she had already survived the worst that fate could offer her, and had built, from those ashes, a life entirely worth living. Below her, Kieran looked up and caught her eye, offering the same warm smile that had first caught her attention years earlier in a healing hall far from home, and Elena made her way down to join her family in the garden, carrying with her the quiet, unshakable peace of a woman who had finally, completely, come home to herself.